Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, Matt Rojansky. He joins us to discuss recent developments concerning the INF Treaty, one of the crown jewels of negotiations between the U.S. and then Soviet Union, and now could be over.
Yeah, looking more likely than not that it has seen its last sunrise. And, you know, some would argue that this is a tragedy, that this is the beginning of the end, or maybe past the beginning of the end of nuclear arms control, period. And maybe the beginning of the nightmare scenario that John F. Kennedy envisioned some 50 years ago when he talked about, but for the nuclear nonproliferation regime, a world of 25 or 30 nuclear powers. Others say not that much to see here. In fact, the treaty has been defunct in reality for many years. The United States privately and then publicly has called Russia out for violations going back almost a decade at this point. Certainly early in the Obama administration, they were already making this point to Russian counterparts. The Russians have, as far as we can tell, not changed their posture violating the treaty. They've in fact said now that they are also going to abrogate since the United States is pulling out. So in effect, the treaty's dead, and yet it's not big news. And in part, I would note, John, that the development that is changing the game for both sides, for the United States and Russia as the successor to the Soviet Union, is a development that's changing the world around us, and that is the rise of China as a major political and security actor in the world, but certainly in East Asia, of which both Russia and the United States are a part.
So expand on that. How does China factor into the thinking of Russia and the United States in this regard?
So very simple. First, it makes sense to define what it is the INF Treaty did at the time and what it would do now. So the INF Treaty bans delivery systems. That is to say, not the part that goes boom, but the missile part that delivers it.
Delivery systems.
Land-based delivery systems with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So below 500 being considered short range, above 5,500 being considered intercontinental, so sort of useful only for targeting the continental United States from Russia and vice versa. And the theory of this in 1987 was essentially, well, let's get missiles out of Europe. Let's get American missiles out of Europe and Soviet missiles out of European Russia. And that would be stabilizing, because then by definition the two nuclear superpowers would have fewer kind of crisis-inducing triggers on the European continent, which, as we know, triggered a number of crises throughout the Cold War, and they'd also have more warning time and more decision time if launches had to take place kind of from the main homeland. The China angle on this has become increasingly important. Of course, China's been a nuclear power for more than half a century now, but increasingly its conventional military capability, as well as its nuclear delivery capability, its command and control, and its political and strategic intent are making it a force to be reckoned with for both Russia and the United States. The Russians, for their part, and I think this is a reasonable position on Russia's part, although they don't acknowledge it, they need intermediate range systems to effectively deter China. It's just geography. It's about the distances between where they would deploy the systems in their large land territory and where China is. And arguably for the United States, and a number of my colleagues, including Abe Denmark, director of the Asia program here and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration, they make this argument that there are potentially some advantages to deploying land-based intermediate range systems on the territory of U.S. allies in East Asia that would be more stabilizing than the current sea-based or potentially air-based deterrent posture that the United States relies on.
Stabilizing in terms of deterrence.
In terms of deterrence, right. Nobody's goal here is a disarming preemptive first strike, nuclear winter kind of craziness. Again, the folks who say nothing to see here, this isn't that big a development, would simply point to, a couple of potential new deployments or even just tests that would send signals that might, at the end of the day, actually promote a new round of arms control, because the recognition would dawn on Beijing that, hey, we really should be part of the global arms control regime along with Russia and the United States, and we shouldn't just sit back and kind of take advantage.
Everybody says Russia's been cheating, of course, except Russia. And you say
which says we've been cheating, by the way.
Which says we've been. Any validity to that?
So It depends on your definition of cheating.
Because these get down to very technical
It's
judgments.
very technical. Arms control at the end of the day is about two things. It's about political will on the part of the very top leaders. So, when President Reagan and, Premier Gorbachev agreed there's going to be a treaty, they say there shall be a treaty, and voila, the second part, the technical expertise, it comes together and we get a treaty. Because the thing is, it's like writing a contract. You can write a contract to do anything. It just depends on whether you want to write a contract or not. So the political will today is lost. The technical expertise is still more or less there, although we're suffering from kind of a generational problem in the arms control community. It's been a long time since we've negotiated a full-ranging treaty, except for New START, which is the last treaty left standing. And let me just note, New START is now very much in the spotlight because it will die a natural death in 2021 if it's not extended by mutual agreement. And the signaling of having effectively killed INF by mutual consent is, why would we extend New START? At least the atmospherics are pretty negative.
The John Huntsman had an op-ed this week, and where he wrote that the Russian government has one last chance to save the INF treaty by returning to full and verifiable compliance. We hope Russia will take that step. Is this an opportunity to start talking and come up with a better mousetrap?
Well, we all hope Russia will come back into compliance. The reasons why Russia isn't in compliance now are unlikely to go away. So we talked about the China factor. Their objections to the U.S. side of the equation are well known for a very long time. They worry that our missile defense system is effectively dual capable, that we can launch offensive missiles from missile defense launching facilities on land. They argue that that's an INF violation, but whether it's an INF violation or not, they're freaked out about it because they worry that it can negate their strategic deterrent. I think that's incorrect, but that's been their concern for a long time. They also worry about our advanced drone technologies, our advanced so-called conventional prompt global strike systems, and many other systems, including space, etc. So the issue is, are we going to have a new wide-ranging arms control conversation where there is both political will that says we need to have a new treaty and it needs to take all of this into account, and technical expertise to figure out what I'd call at the end of the day probably complex translations between how many traditional nuclear warheads is equal to one drone in terms of stability. How much do you have to give up in order to get the other side to give up something? It's a technical question, but you got to have the political will in the first place.
Well, there's almost a parallel with, say, NAFTA, where you had an old agreement that had become somewhat outdated based on technology, and similarly, you have that here. That led to a new round of negotiations towards something that was a 21st century deal.
Right, and we've got a new agreement, and we're almost at ratification and implementation of that agreement, but we had political will. Right? We had an administration on our part that whatever their objections to the old agreement, we're committed to having a new agreement.
Right.
And I think the concern now is in this complex kind of multi-power world that we're in with a rising China that is saying it doesn't want to be part of arms control, of negotiated arms control agreements. It's not clear to John Bolton in the White House, probably to President Trump, as to why we should bind ourselves to such agreements that are based on a bipolar world of the past.
These are weapon systems with large price tags. What about the economics of some sort of new arms race?
Yeah, well, it's expensive. One of the ironies, budget and Congress debates on these things is not per se my area of expertise, but I've been in Washington for a decade and a half, and what I've tended to notice is, regardless of the positions that the various sides stake out, the loser almost always ends up being the U.S. Treasury, which ends up kind of footing the bill for, pay for something to make these people happy, then pay for something else to make these people happy. So what's very likely to happen, I think, is we'll go forward investing in a wide range of systems, including systems that we have no intention whatsoever of using or deploying. And that will be to make certain constituencies happy, potentially to use them as bargaining chips, potentially as part of utterly unrelated political deals. And, quite frankly, it is generally the case that where you sit is where you stand. And, people who feel that their jobs, their livelihood depends on building new nuclear toys tend to want to build new nuclear toys. Excuse
the indelicate choice of words, but the word that
I've already been indelicate.
Well, the word that comes to mind when I think of the U.S. Russian dialogue is constipated. And I think somewhat as a result of the Mueller investigation and the questions about collusion, are we even at any place where there could be this level of negotiations between Putin-led and Trump-led governments under these circumstances?
This is a really difficult moment. I need to give credit where it's due. I think that there is more work being done by the two governments than meets the eye at this point. The public discourse is just utterly out of whack because it is framed entirely by politics. The reality is, when you talk about Russia and U.S. Russia relations from the United States of America, 98% of the content of that has nothing to do with the Mueller investigation. But 98% of the coverage of it and the public discussion of it, and even, sadly, the congressional discussion and some of the official discussion, is responding to and exploiting aspects of the Mueller investigation and scandal. That is a loss because it means we're missing the areas in which Russia and the United States are amazingly still functionally working together on issues where they have to. And we're missing the potential for, if we could simply have at least, look, we've got a conflict with Russia. There should be no ambiguity about that. But a managed conflict, right? We had a managed conflict for most of the Cold War. Then we could convene new, effective arms control negotiations from a very tough position on our side, and they'll take a very tough position on their side, and we'll get the best deal we can get. But we've done it before, and it's worked out well before.
Long-term risk is obvious, some runaway type of arms race. What about the short-term implications of this? Is it a big to-do about nothing?
Not necessarily. In the very short term, I don't think a lot's going to change because these are all long lead time decisions, so you can't just snap your fingers and deploy a whole new nuclear arsenal. But we are going to make middle and longer term relevant decisions right now today that are going to play out with budgetary and deployment implications. Also, in 2020 and 2021, we have a couple of key inflection points coming that are relevant for the whole world. One is the Non-Proliferation Treaties Review Conference. It takes place every 5 years. These are the conferences at which every country in the world, both non-nuclear states and nuclear states, come together to reconfirm their intention to live by the rules of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which basically means the nuclear haves will try to get towards nuclear elimination. And the nuclear have-nots will not try to become nuclear haves, at least as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. To go into 2020, coming off of the last several years of just dysfunction in global nuclear arms control is worrying, because the nuclear have-nots, who have already voted for a treaty banning nuclear weapons in the UN General Assembly, that arguably doesn't have the force of binding law, but still it's out there, they have a very good argument to say, well, you nuclear haves are not doing anything serious to hold up your side of the bargain, so why should we withhold our pursuit of nuclear weapons? You know, obviously North Korea is out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran is in, and then you've got the whole JCPOA issue. But for the kind of medium-sized, potential nuclear aspirant states of the world, and I won't name any names here, this is going to be a very big issue in 2020.
No such thing as an inconsequential nuclear explosion either. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, this is clearly among those short list of most important issues. Thanks for helping us sort through it, Matt.
Thanks a lot, John.